This video is going to show you the best way to add reminders to your approval flows. It's a jam-packed episode this week, so let's get into it. So I'm on my demo site and I'm in the sales documents library. We're going to be adding the approval to this. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the tile menu and go to Power Automate. And we're going to create a new flow. It's going to be automated. We'll give it the name Document Review. And for the trigger, we're going to search for when a file is modified or created. When a file is created or modified, properties only. That's what we're looking for under the SharePoint connector. So we're in our new flow. Let's hook this up to the library. And there's a couple of variables we're going to create that we'll need later on. So let's initialize the reminder count variable, and we'll just start this off at 0. The max number of reminders, we're going to set that later on. Just gave it a better name, and let's create one more. We'll call this one Approval Complete. And we're going to set this to the Boolean value of false. So the Approval Complete flag is going to go true when we want to exit out of our loop that you'll see below. The reminder count variable is going to be incremented every time we send out a reminder, and then once we hit the max value, we're going to break out of our loop by setting the Approval Complete flag. So we'll be using that flag a few different times. So next we want to update the status, because the status field here is going to give us a couple of options. So we're going to have different statuses. Submitted is going to indicate we want to start our approval process. Once we are in the approval, we'll be setting this to pending approval. And then obviously there's two outcomes, approved or rejected. So let's set our pending approval status as our first real action on this flow. So we'll update file properties. For the ID, we can get that from our trigger. And we'll just set the status to pending approval. And now that we've updated the status to pending approval, the next thing I really want to do is go up and address this trigger. If you notice, it's going to fire off if that file is modified. Well, we're modifying the metadata right here. That will re-trigger the trigger, and that would give us an infinite loop, causing us to have to manually cancel the flow and fix the problem. So we're going to make sure that this trigger only fires if the status value is set to submitted. Here's a shortcut I use for that. I'll add a compose action. And under the expression tab, I'll use the equals function. And this just takes two parameters. The first is going to be status value from our trigger. So I'll go down to the bottom, which is generally always the trigger, and it is. I'll go down here and find status value. And then use the end key to go to the end of this statement. Put a comma, and the second value I want it to be submitted. So if these two values are the same, this is going to return true. So I'm going to click OK here. And then we're going to end up deleting this, but what we want to do is go to peak code, and this will give us the expression that we need. So this is the actual expression for the equals function that we just typed in. I'm going to copy this, click done, and then I'm going to click the three dots for my trigger and go to settings. And now at the bottom of the settings, you can specify the trigger condition. So anything you type in here, and you can have multiple conditions, they will all have to be true for this trigger to fire. So this is where we want to put that check to make sure that the status is equal to submitted. So I'll paste that into here and click done. So it'll fire off one time. We'll update the file properties to pending approval, and that will no longer be equal to submitted, so it's not going to re-trigger itself. And this is very important to do to make sure you don't have an infinite loop, because Power Automate will not stop you from creating an infinite loop, although it will warn you if you look over in the flow checker. If you're updating the same item that you're reading from as we are, then it will warn you to make sure you do not have an infinite loop condition. So having done that, we can continue. So we can collapse this back down and collapse this, and we can delete this because we only needed it to use that peek code function. Now we're going to create our actual approval. So we'll add a new action and type in create approval. Now you may have used the start and wait for an approval in the past. I'm going to do these separately and you'll see how that's going to work. So I'm just going to create an approval, and this will actually send it out as well. But it's not going to wait on anything. It's going to immediately go to the next action. For this simple approval, we're just going to do first to respond. We're only going to have a single approver, and that's going to be Adele Vance. I can go ahead and assign her right here. And we'll type in a brief message. For the item link, we could use the trigger, and you'll see a link to item. And for the item link description, we can search for the name field. And we want the one, just to be on the safe side, we want the one from the trigger. So that should do it for our first approval. The next thing we're going to do is actually start our loop. This loop's going to wait a certain amount of time for our approval response from Adele. And if it doesn't come in time, we're going to send out a reminder and then go back to waiting again. So we're going to go into new step, go into the control and add a do until. And our condition is going to be if approval complete is equal to true. Now we want to make sure that the do until doesn't time out on us. So we're going to expand change limits. We're going to change the timeout from 1 hour to the maximum value, which is 30 days. And that'll make sure it stays running while we need it to. So we'll close this up and continue. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add an action, and we're going to put the other half of this approval, which is wait for an approval. This just takes one argument, and that's the ID of the approval record in Dataverse, and that will come from this create an approval step. You'll see approval ID. This will pause for a certain amount of time until Adele responds. Now, what we can do is for this exercise, we can go into settings and we can control how long that waits. It's going to wait until the workflow times out after 30 days, and we don't want that. Ideally, for this type of a use case, I would put in this expression, which means 7 days. So we could remind her in a week that this is pending her approval. So we'll click done here. Now, if Adele responds within that week, then it's going to continue on to the next action. If Adele doesn't respond in time, then it's going to time out on this action, and we're going to handle that as well. So first we'll add the condition where Adele responds in time. And all we really need to do at this point is set a variable, and that variable is going to be approval complete. And we're going to set this to true. And this will immediately break us out of our do until and go on to end the flow. We can also add an email notification to the original user. So we could send this to from the trigger, the created by email, that's the person that uploaded the document. And we'll just type in a basic response. and then maybe add a reference to the document name. And that should be good for this. We'll save this. Again, we have that reminder. We'll just have to keep closing this each time because we know that we've got our workflow configured correctly. So now we're going to configure the timeout side of this workflow. So we're going to click on the plus sign, add a parallel branch, and this is going to send out our reminders. So we're going to go to control and add a condition here. And here's where we're going to start looking at this other variable, reminder count. We're going to send out 3 reminders. So first we'll check to see, are we at our maximum number of reminders? If we're not, then we're going to send out our reminder email. And we'll put in our body. Oh, and if you've noticed, I'm using a shortcut for some of these email bodies. This is through a utility program called Text Blaze. What it does is it lets you type in shortcuts like / and then a certain keyword that you program, and it'll replace it with whatever text you want, whether it's plain text, whether it's tables. It really has a lot of function. I've been enjoying using this thing. I use it for emails, conversations on the web. Heck, even in Power Automate, I'm able to use this. And it really helps if you've got something repetitive. Like I do a lot of approval workflows, so I'm typing in the same or similar things quite often. And this type of a shortcut helps me out a lot, where I can just type in my case, DOCAPP, and it immediately replaces it with all that. So all I have to do is remember a little snippet, and then it saves me a lot of time personally. If you'd like to try it out, there's a link in the description for 1 month of the Pro version. And I thank Text Blaze for sponsoring this video. So our email is going to be sent out to our approver. And I realized that this should not have been created by email. This should have been Dell, the person who's approving. You could also use a variable up at the top if you wanted to store that information, or if you had a list somewhere else on SharePoint that listed who approved the documents for this particular library, or even the site. So after we send the reminder to Adele, we're going to increment our counter variable. And there's a neat action here called increment variable. And that works perfect for situations like this. We could just say, reminder count should go up by 1. So after the first execution, it'll go from a 0 to a 1, and then to a 2. And then once we get to a 3, then we'll go into this yes branch and we can exit the flow. So let's add that stuff now. So the first thing we're going to do once we get to our 3rd reminder is we're going to set our other variable that lets us break out of this loop. Approval complete, and we'll set this to true. So this will break us out of our workflow and ultimately end the workflow. But we also want to do something with this list item, otherwise it'll just never get approved. So what we can do is update the file properties. And we'll select our site, list, or library in this case. We'll go to the trigger and get our ID. And we'll change the status value. Actually, we'll leave it right here as submitted. So this will change it back from pending approval back to submitted and restart this entire process. Now, if you wanted to do something different, you could just send the person an email. Instead of update the list item properties, maybe tell them to resubmit it. But this really helps out that user and just restarts the process if for some reason Adele just didn't get those approvals. Where this also helps us is the fact that these flows will only run for 30 days before they're terminated automatically. So what this can do is we'll be close to that mark after all of our reminders, and this branch here will help us to end this flow and start a brand new one, giving us another month that we can wait on approvals. Hopefully it won't take Adele that long the second time around. So let's save this. And again, we've got those warnings. So let's close this up And one thing that you'll notice is that these are parallel branches, and we only want this right side to execute if the approval times out. So we need to configure for that to happen. We're going to configure this condition, and there's an option that says configure run after. By default, it'll only run after the approval has completed successfully, which would actually mean we got an approve or reject, and we should be going down this branch. For here, we want to change it to a timeout so that it only runs when the approval has timed out, which would be 7 days based on how we've configured this right here. So if we have an approval within 7 days, it's going to go down this left branch. Otherwise, we're going to send out a reminder, go back to the top of this loop, and wait for the approval again. Eventually, we're going to break out of our loop because we've reminded Adele too many times, and we'll restart the entire process. Now, there's one more thing we need to do since we have these parallel branches, and we need to kind of close them back up. Otherwise, there'll be weird errors in the flow run history. And it's a little silly that we have to do this, but all we have to do is put in any sort of an action. Compose will work fine, and if you haven't tried out Compose, what it really does is just let you put in any sort of information and kind of build out expressions or build out values without having to declare a variable. It's got its uses, but it's really great here. So we have to put in some sort of a value. I'll just put in the phrase, ending the flow. It won't do anything at all, but it does close up these parallel branches and give us a nice clean running flow. The other thing we need to do is make sure that this compose will run regardless of which branch actually executes. And to do that, we're going to click on the 3 dots, go to configure run after. We want to make sure that both of these options on the left show both succeeded and skipped. And you kind of have to click from one to the other to get the checkboxes to kind of switch back and forth. So both of them are showing that they'll run on succeed or skip, and then that'll finish our closing. And one thing that's missing here is when we get to this email, we're assuming that it's approved. We haven't actually checked the outcome of the approval. We still need one more step here. So we're going to put something in the middle of here. We'll add a condition, and we're going to compare the outcome to the word approve. So if the document was approved, then yes, we'll send the approval message. If it wasn't, then we'll send them a reject message. So let's add a rejection email. So there's the reject email, and we'll update the status while we're here as well. In fact, we need to do it on both sides of this. We can copy and paste this over here and set this status to approved. And I think that will do it. And now let's walk through this logic before we execute it. So we're going to update the file properties to set it to pending approval so we don't re-trigger this later on. We're going to create our approval, and then we're going to start our reminder loop. We're going to wait for 7 days. If the approval happens before then we're going to set our approval complete variable to true so we can break out of our loop. And then we're going to address the outcome. If it was approved, then we send an email and update the status to approved. If it was rejected, same thing. We'll update the status to rejected. And if we need to send a reminder, we'll count up to 3 reminders. And this field's going to control the number of reminders that we send out. If we need to send the reminder, we go down the right branch, we send the email, increment our counter. Otherwise, if we're done with reminders, then we'll set approval complete equal to true and update our file properties to submitted to restart this entire approval from the beginning. Let's save this and try it out. But to be able to test this without waiting a week for each of these reminders, we need to change our waiting period. So we can change the settings on the wait step. And from 7 days, which is what I would do for production, we can do 1 minute. So this will speed things up a bit more. So let's save this and go test it out. So we'll upload our new contract. And you'll see that it has a default status of submitted, and that should fire off our workflow immediately. Okay, so now we can see that the workflow started. Let's go check Adele's email. And yep, there's the email in Adele's mailbox. We've also got the reminder that's coming through, but we do have some issues to fix on this. So let's go back, correct that, and also put a link back in here to go back to the approval form. So we're back in the form. We can delete that character and then we'll add in the respond link that will send them to the form where they can approve it. And now the thing about this respond link is it's just going to put a URL in text. It is not going to actually be a hyperlink. So we can switch over here to code view and we can convert that to a hyperlink. And that should do it. Let's save this and go test it out. So here you could see that we've got our reminders coming in nicely. We also have our second flow that's fired off here. So after the 3 reminders, the flow is ending and starting a brand new copy, and we're getting that reminder. So it looks like everything's working perfectly. You know, Power Automate flows can be very powerful, and it just takes a little bit of creativity to come up with some really neat solutions. If you liked this video and got value from it, let me know by clicking that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.